I'm Allison Jonjak, the Cranberry Outreach Specialist with the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension. These videos are the on-demand recordings of UW Extension and the Wisconsin State Cranberry Growers Association's virtual brown bag lunch series. These monthly sessions offer growers and researchers a way to share timely and relevant information. We hope you'll enjoy and continue to engage with us.
Hi, everyone. My name is Grant Holly. I'm the Executive Director of the Wisconsin State Cranberry Growers Association. We are very happy to be able to partner with UW Extension to bring you the research needed to be able to navigate our ever-changing environment. I'd like to thank all of our speakers today for their valuable time and leadership, the growers for joining us, and Allison for being the catalyst from which all of these sessions rely. Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for joining us on this atypical 1 p.m. Brown bag here for our third Friday of the month, July brown bag.
Yeah, perfect. Sounds good. All right. So I put together today a little presentation about heat stress in cranberry, and just thinking about the plant responses, like what happens when there's heat stress, what happens to the plant, what are the implications for yield. But then I also wanted to just link it a little bit to some of the work that we're doing on trying to understand whether heat stress is related with fruit rot. So the question that you might be asking is like, why are we interested in learning about heat stress in cranberry, given that it's not something that we often see in our region as a problem. However, we do know that the predictions about what's going to happen with climate is that we will experience higher number of these extremely hot days per year by mid-century. The average summer temperature has increased since 1979 by about 1.4 Fahrenheit during the summer and about 2.6 Fahrenheit during the fall, as we are like in the time where we are approaching harvest. And as I said, climate projections for our state forecast that by 2050, we will be having over 73 days with temperatures that are going to be over 86 Fahrenheit. And you're like, that's a very specific number, but then you'll see why. And then over 7 days in which there's forecasted that the temperatures are going to be over 95. So these are obviously, projections of what might happen in the future. But one thing that we do know and that we could learn from what's happening in other growing regions, in other cranberry growing regions, is we know that in places like New Jersey and to some extent now in places like in Massachusetts, they have been experiencing more of these extreme heat temperatures that that might eventually come to us as well. And so we need to be sort of prepared to understand if this scenario is going to happen and we're going to get more heat stress, what's happening to the plants, how this is going to affect just overall plant performance and yield and fruit quality. So I'm going to go through sort of like a little bit of a review of what we know and what others have investigated and what my lab is working on right now. So when we think about the impacts of elevated temperature on plant physiology, some of the things that we know is that for the majority of the plants, including cranberries, the ideal or the temperature in which the plants, perform the best, the air temperatures in which plants perform the best is somewhere between 68 to 86 Fahrenheit. That is the ideal range. And actually some research show that the highest rate of photosynthesis in cranberry leaves is achieved when temperatures are around 86. So below that, it's a lower rate. When we go over the 86, that rate starts declining because it's just too hot. And when we think about some of the effects of this heat stress, one of the first signs that we see, the first things that is going to happen with the plant is that we're going to have a drop in gas exchange in leaves. So what this means is like if there's a drop on the absorption of CO2, that is obviously essential for photosynthesis. And so the plant just closes the stomata, does not absorb any more CO2, photosynthesis drops, and then obviously because the stomatas are closed, the transpiration also decreases, and then it's very difficult for the plant to cool themselves, and they're trying to preserve some of that water. The other impacts that we know happen is, obviously there's going to be impacts in terms of growth and yield. If photosynthesis is reduced because of heat stress, that means that there's going to be few carbohydrates that are going to be produced. And this is going to lead to poor fruit set and also smaller berries. But another thing that is going to happen is that if the plants are stressed because of heat and their photosynthesis rate is lower, that is also going to eventually impact the formation of flower primordia for the following year. So it's just not what's happening this growing season, but it has a carryover effect the following year. And obviously, lower levels of photosynthesis will result in those lower levels of reserves that could eventually, if the plants are really stressed, affect our winter survivor. So those are all things that happen when with elevated temperatures during the growing season. There has been some work done in Canada, specifically looking at what happens with cranberry plants get too hot. And some of the things that they've discovered, and there's a graph here that shows a little bit of their study, the results of their studies, is that one of the critical heat thresholds that they identified is that cranberry leaf photosynthesis drops significantly when the temperature exceeds 91 Fahrenheit. So when we get to those levels of canopy temperature, the photosynthesis is going down, and it will have the effects that I just described. I just said that, around the optimum temperatures is around the 77 to 84. That's when you get most of the CO2 simulation. And then as we get to higher temperatures, you can see that is dropping when we get to 11% when we get to 91 Fahrenheit, and then it drops to 22% when you get to 98 Fahrenheit, due partially because, there's a stomatal close, and that just, stops the entire process. The other thing that this study report is that in Wisconsin, cranberry beds can experience up to 37 days per year in which the air temperature is over 82 Fahrenheit. So one thing is air temperature, and the other thing is actually how hot the leaves of the plants are going to be. So when the temperatures are about 82 and it's a sunny day and there's not a lot of clouds, then those leaves are going to heat up quite a bit, and that could go like all the way up to 91. And by that time, you're having some significant reduction in photosynthesis. So this is a really interesting study by our colleagues in the Laval University. Other effects that we know can happen due to heat stress, especially on flowers and fruit set. If we have a reduction in photosynthesis due to this heat stress, especially this is happening, as I said, during the growing season while those buds are setting and we're starting to form the flowers for the next spring, is that this could result in poor flower formation, and that could potentially increase umbrella bloom. That could be some of the consequences of heat stress during the summer. But then another thing to think about is that elevated temperatures actually during late spring when we're in bloom will also affect the viability of the pollen, but also the lifespan of those flowers. So if it's hotter and there's more solar irrigation, those tissues that are very succulent and very sensitive of flowers are going to desiccate really fast, and the period for pollination might be shorter, ended up with less fruit set. So that is definitely a problem. And I've talked with some of the growers in areas like New Jersey and to some extent in BC, and they've commented that having this really, really high temperatures during the spring seems to be affecting their overall yield, and is something that they're concerned with. And I think about them as looking at our potential future scenarios. So that is something to consider. So when it comes to the actual fruit, these are some pictures of some of the experiments that we've been running here in Wisconsin with different type of damage. What happens with the damage in the fruit? most of the damage that we see here is, the damage responsible for this overheating of the berries, which can be due to direct solar radiation, especially in these areas that the surface of the fruit that is exposed, and that causes what we refer to as scalding. So you can see here there's different types of damage. We have a classic damage of photochemical reaction that can occur with like too much solar radiation that will lead to some like cellular damage in the fruit. And so you can see some of that damage in the first picture. But then we can also have the effect of the solar radiation that is hitting and the fruit, and then that fruit gets really, really, really hot. And then you can see in some cases a little bit of bleaching here of anthocyanins. And then you can see here in this green fruit that you can see all of these different effects. So these are all sort of damage that we've been able to recreate by applying heat into the field and trying to figure out what are the kind of different damages that we get from heat stress. These are not the result of natural heat stress events here in Wisconsin, though the pictures look very similar to what others are reporting, especially in areas like in New Jersey, and again, to some extent in Massachusetts, that they see this type of damage as well. So thinking about this effect on the fruit, this scalding on the fruit, some of the things that we know is that the temperature of the fruit, the same as the temperature of the leaf, can be higher than the air temperature. So because the fruit does not have stomata and does not transpire, it warms up very fast. And in some cases, the temperature of the fruit can be up to 30 Fahrenheit above the ambient temperature. This is especially true in the worst case scenarios for heat stress, that is that we have really heavy solar radiation, there's no clouds, and humidity is very low. In those cases, you might be monitoring air temperature, but the fruit itself can be up to 30 Fahrenheit higher in temperature than the air temperature. And as I said, some of the factors that are going to increase this difference is the amount of solar radiation, the wind speed, and the relative humidity. So low relative humidity are definitely going to affect that. And this is a graph that I borrow from Dr. Peter Ottermans from Rutgers University in New Jersey. He has been doing a ton of really interesting work because, as you know, this is heat stress is a big problem there. And what I want to illustrate in this graph is the difference in temperature between this line here that's called shielded, which will represent a temperature probe, just measuring air temperature, versus fruits in different stages. And you can see that fruit that is red, so mature fruit, get really, really, really hot compared with what the air temperature is measuring. Those that are in that yellowish stage, which having a little bit of blush, a little bit less, and then the ones that are green are a little bit lower temperature. So there's definitely a differential in the fruit temperature compared with what we are monitoring as air temperature. And then I just put a little picture here of some of the work that we're doing right now, in which we are measuring internal berry temperature on some of these heat stress treatments and trying to compare, very similar to what Dr. Ottermans did, to just compare what's the difference between when we monitor air temperature versus what's really happening in the fruit. So that is something to take into account when you're looking at your records of air temperature, that fruit might be a lot warmer, and that's especially true when the fruits are already red, because they will be absorbing more of that radiation. This is another picture that I borrowed from a really good publication. If you want to learn a little bit more, this is a publication by Dr. Ottermans and by Dr. Giverson Mupambi from UMass on scales in Cranberry. I put a reference there. If you want a link to the publication, let me know. But they have been doing some work monitoring this. And as I said before, fruit that is ripe, that has red color, is going to be more vulnerable to have this damage, because they don't have a lot of chlorophyll anymore, this green pigment. And so chlorophyll will be able to, when the fruits are green and they have chlorophyll, that pigment is going to be able to dissipate some of the solar radiation through photosynthesis. So in that case, when the fruits are green, they warm up less than when they are red, full of anthocyanins. And so that's the next point, that the anthocyanins is not able to dissipate some of the solar radiation. So that ends in overheating of the berries, and then that ends in damage and correlates actually pretty well to some of the results that we're seeing in our study. So their studies and data show that when the internal berry temperature reaches about 108 Fahrenheit over 2 hours is when you can definitely see that some of this scalding and that some of this damage happens. And this is the internal berry temperature. And so going back to the previous point, that is more or less when the air temperature is about 90 Fahrenheit. So again, there's a big difference there. And there's higher differences between the fruit and the air temperature. Again, if we have high solar radiation, no coverage of no cloud coverage, very little wind, and then low humidity. And that low humidity is somewhere between 35 to 45%. So when we have those levels of humidity, this damage gets exacerbated, and we see more scald. So that describes more or less like what we see, what are the effects, what are some of the damage, how to think about air temperature and fruit temperature. But I also wanted to put some ideas about what can we do in terms of mitigating heat stress. Again, I borrow this from Dr. Erdemans and the data that he has been collected in New Jersey, but one of the strategies that we know very well, because Cranberry is very well suited for that, is this evaporative cooling, in which we are providing cooler water that helps the plant lower their temperature, but also helps by just evaporating, having this water on top of the foliage and the berries and evaporating and taking with it some of this extra heat. And so you can see in this image, in which in the middle of the image in the middle here of this panel is this is a thermal camera, and you can see that everything that is more into the orange, yellow and orange is higher temperature, versus those that are into the more purple is lower temperature. And you can clearly see where they are applying irrigation, that the temperature of that canopy of those vines is much lower than where there's no irrigation being provided, so no evaporative cooling. So it's very effective. And again, we can see here in the graph, that's exactly what they're showing. They're showing that the internal berry temperature before the irrigation is set on, it's pretty high, over 105. But as soon as the irrigation starts, the temperature drops sharply and is very effective. So we know that this works. I know that there's been a lot of talks about but these droplets of water on the canopy and on the berries could be acting as a magnifying glass that could produce more damage. Well, I actually found a paper that specifically looks at this, and that is actually not physically possible. They say that when you have, these high temperatures and this low humidity, the water will evaporate before any of that could happen. And so that's sort of one of those myths that I want to say is not true, that these droplets that are that stayed on the canopy and the berries, when we apply overhead irrigation for evaporative cooling, will produce more damage. That is just certainly not true. And a very interesting paper about physics that I was reviewing for this presentation. So this is one method that we have, and we know it works really well. Where we might not know is what is the effect of all of this extra irrigation on fruit quality, things like firmness. We actually don't know about that, but I want to share with all of you that we're currently working with colleagues in Oregon, Washington, and also in Massachusetts to do submit a proposal that we're going to be looking at heat stress on cranberries and blueberries, and some of the work that some of my colleagues, especially from UMass, are going to be looking at is going to be looking at some of this effect of evaporative cooling on fruit quality. We know it works, but we still don't know what other effects could have in fruit quality and rot. Other mitigation strategies could be some spray products that we have, and there's a whole different range of products that can be used as protective of the fruit and the foliage. The most common one, I think, like the first technology that appeared is this particle film technology that reflects solar radiation. And because of that, it just reduces the surface temperatures of the berries. One of the products that is commonly used is called Surround, which is this white clay that is inert and is spray over. It covers everything with white, and that obviously helps reduce radiation. That's one type of technology. The other one is products that are called anti-transparent or film-forming polymers. In this case, what they do is they reduce water loss from the leaves and the fruits by forming this semi-permeable barrier that slows down transpiration and that helps retain water. An example of those products is VaporGuard. We use this product on other crops such as grapes. Then there's the whole world of biostimulants and stress mitigation compounds. The idea behind this group is that these biostimulants, what they would do would be to enhance the plant internal tolerance to heat or to oxidative stress that happens because of solar radiation. And in this group of biostimulants, we find all these products with seaweed extract and silicone-based products. We also have some amino acids, some humid substance. There's many products with this biostimulant. And then the last group of sprayable products that we have are what we call the sunscreen or UV blocker that either block or absorb UV and infrared radiation. And this, also helps cool the plant to avoid that they get overheat. Some of the products in this category, if you're familiar with any of this product, is Parka and Ultra V. We've used Parka quite a bit with the apple growers that are already experiencing some of these heat stress issues here in Wisconsin. And again, Dr. Ertemans at Rutgers University has been doing a lot of work. I think he's probably the one that does the most work on heat stress. And I borrowed this from one of his presentations that he's showing some of the results of some trials that he ran with kaolin clay. And so you can see here on the two graphs on the bottom, he had two different doses of the product, a control with no application of no product at all, one that is at a lower rate of kaolin clay and one at double the rate. And you can definitely see on those bars that there's a difference there's a reduction in the surface temperature of the fruit, which are the bars in red, and then not so much with the canopy, but still there's a slight reduction in the temperature of the canopy. But then you can see with the harvest that there seems to be quite a bit of difference, that the treatment with the high level of kaolin clay, which is here the one that would look whiter, had a significantly higher yield than the control and the one with the lower. One of the problems with this product in particular is that, as you can see in this picture here, it leaves a residue. This clay leaves a residue, and that could be potentially a problem with the fruit handlers. But that it works, it does work. So that is sort of like a summary of what we know, what are some of the mitigation strategies that we have. The other one that is also available, but is really not practical, though it works really well on other crops, is using nets. And so in apple, we use a lot of the apple growers are installing nets over these trailing systems that they have to be able to reduce solar radiation. But in the case of cranberries, that would be highly impractical, even though they have been tested by Dr. Ertemans, and they are very, very efficient at reducing the temperature of the berries and the canopies. So the last thing I want to talk about is a little bit of the work that we are doing on trying to understand whether heat stress has a relationship with fruit rot. So the question that we're trying to ask is whether heat stress could trigger the expression of the disease. And you can see here, this is a sample of some of the rot that we saw on our trial last year. Last year, we collected our first year of data, and this year we are repeating the study. This is led by a scientist in my lab. Many of you know her, Dr. Jenny Bolivar Medina, that is doing this work at the research station. You have probably seen these crazy open top chambers that we have installed there. And what we're doing is we're looking at applying acute heat stress events at different times during the growing season, whether they're single application or repeated applications on the same spot. And then we're trying to see if these heat events are resulting in more fruit rot. The hypothesis behind this is that these heat stress events might be changing the biochemical composition of the berries. And that would allow the fungi. We all know that fruit rot is a complex of many fungi, so it's a pathogen. That the change in the biochemical composition of the berry would allow the pathogen to just colonize those berries and just trigger the disease, and that's when we see the symptoms. So that's what we're trying to test. And then I have some really preliminary data here that we collected from last year, and we're doing this in Mullica and Stevens. You can see the graph on your left side is Mullica and on your right side Stevens. And we have here the different treatments that we're applying. Treatment number D is an one heat stress application closer to harvest when all the fruits are already colored. And you can see that this one is the one that had the highest percentage of fruit rot compared with all of the other ones and the control as well. So we can see that we are able to trigger a little bit of this rot in these treatments in which we are applying heat stress. The results seems to be a lot more consistent in something like Mullica. In Stevens are a little bit inconsistent, but again, this is our preliminary data and we only have 1 year of data. We are actually going to start collecting our second year of data now during this summer. So as a summary of everything that I presented today, we're expected to have a higher frequency of these extremely hot days in the upcoming years. As I said before, we are already seeing some of these on other fruit crops, especially on apples. These heat stress events, what they're going to do is they're going to reduce the photosynthetic capacity. That will obviously have an impact on fruit set if this happens early in the spring during bloom. But they're also going to have an impact on fruit quality if we get a lot of scald, if these heat events happen in the growing season, but especially as we're moving towards the end of the growing season. And this is where, the predictions about how we're going to have more heat events or falls are going to be warmer might potentially be a problem for us. Sun scald can occur when the air temperatures are around 90 Fahrenheit because the internal berry temperature can be much higher, especially if this happens in late August or September when we have the berries have color and it's dry, so we have low humidity. And then there are some mitigation strategies that do work. We know that evaporative cooling works and we're set up to do that. But then there's also other alternatives like some of these sprayable protective products, though I think that more research had to be done on that. And then just to wrap up, we have some ongoing research on this relationship between heat stress and the increased incidence of fruit rot. And with that, just open it up for questions and just acknowledge that some of this work that we're doing on the heat stress and fruit rot is funded by the USDA. And this is a project that the main lead of the project is Dr. Leslie Hall. And with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you guys have.
Thank you for that really in-depth overview, Amaya. I know we've been seeing this heat stress work been going on over the past year and last year, and have been looking forward to hearing what are we learning under those heat stress chambers. So very exciting look, and glad to hear that there's also work being done on what we might be able to do to protect the vines from that. So thank you. Again, if people have questions, either unmute yourself and ask directly, or type into the chat for everyone, or type into the chat using the to Allison Jonjak dropdown, and I can ask anonymously for you. I will also, while we wait to hear a couple questions in, and of course I have not forgotten Rodney's question on genetic purity, but I am going to share my screen to go over a couple of upcoming events so that people can hear those coming in while we're coming up with questions. We'll have a question specifically on heat stress, Amaya. The cooling irrigation, we're used to performing 15 minutes of irrigation when the temp is over 91 Fahrenheit in Quebec. How would what would be the maximum number that you'd recommend to do in a very hot day? And I'm not sure whether that means the maximum number of minutes or the maximum intervals of irrigation that they're doing.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in other settings, with other fruit crops, what we try to do is keep monitoring the temperature so you can cycle in and out. So very similar to what we use for spring frost. So you will turn on the irrigation for 15 minutes, you turn it off, and that in those 15 minutes, the canopy temperature is going to decrease. But then as soon as you turn it off, that temperature is going to start creeping up. And so once it gets up again to that threshold, which is this 91 Fahrenheit, you would have to turn it on again. I don't think that there's a limit to the amount of times that you want to do. What you want to make sure is that you need to monitor what's happening with the temperature, because in a day, which is again, very hot and very dry, it might be that from the moment you turn it off the irrigation to the moment that the temperature goes up again to 91 might be very short. In a day that is hot, but maybe there's a little bit more relative humidity, that change in temperature for it to creep up all the way again to those 91 Fahrenheit might be at a lower rate. So I think that the main takeaway or the message would be you need to be monitoring. And so that is something that we're not necessarily equipped with. And some of the things that we are hoping to develop in this grant that I talk about, and this is something working also with the blueberry growers, is could we have some sort of system in which you are constantly monitoring the air temperature, and then the irrigation, the overhead irrigation for evaporative cooling turns on and off. As you reach that 91, it turns on. When the temperature, let's say you set it to go all the way down to 85, it turns off. But then again, when it goes up, it turns on again. And it could be 15 minutes, it could be 5 minutes, it could be 10 minutes, whatever it takes to get the temperature down. So I don't have an answer for that. I think it will depend on the kind of environmental conditions that you're having in every specific day, and you can only know that by having some active monitoring system.
Yep, and that's the follow-up question was would you cycle every 2 or 3 hours? But I think you just answered that perfectly with you need to monitor, and they don't want to signal to the plant to grow too vegetatively. So apparently there's a needle to thread there.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with that. That you might be that might be a concern that you're really saturating the soil, but in those conditions, you would also expect that the plants by themselves are transpiring a lot. So they're taking a lot of water from the soil. So even though you're irrigating and you're putting that water there, that water is also evaporating really fast. Mm-hmm. So it would not be the same case if it were to be, a cooler day with higher humidity, in which, the plant will be transpiring less. So yeah, I hear you concerned. That's why we need to do more research.
Definitely. I want to return, unless there are other questions on the heat stress topic, and thank you very much for a very, very informative presentation. So just a little bit to share there. Any other questions? Oh, great. And Amaya also shared the link to the fact sheet from Rutgers on heat stress in Cranberry. Any other questions coming in on any of Pam's topics, any of Amaya's topics? Otherwise, I want to thank everyone for being flexible and joining us at the atypical 1 o'clock hour, and hope that no one's stomach rumbled too much for our presentations today, but hope that you're back out into the marshes, and we'll all look forward to seeing you at the mini clinics at Summer Field Day in just under a month here. Thank you, Amaya, and thank you, Pam.
Thank you, Allison.